And man, let's just go ahead and get right into it. And let's start off positive. Let's talk about the NBA extension winners. Of course, the NBA extension for contract extensions as well as rookie max extensions was yesterday, and a lot of guys got paid. A lot of players didn't. Depending on the circumstances, their teams are kind of teetering back and forth. One winner for sure were the Houston Rockets with Kevin Durant. Of course, you make the big time trade for Kevin Durant this past offseason that positioned themselves to finally get that go-to number one option to put next to Amen Thompson and Alperen Sengun. You move off of Dylan Brooks, you move off of Jalen Green, and you position yourself now to be considered as a real contender out west after already being a top seed in the Western Conference last season. You now build on that, and granted, they're now going to be without Fred VanVleet for this upcoming season due to the ACL tear, but Kevin Durant is a pretty solid player to lean on, if I do say myself, as a guy that I think you can be able to play offense through, and being able to rely on somebody like Amen Thompson to take over those point guard responsibilities, I think isn't a bad backdrop for this team either. But let's talk about something that CBS Sports reported when they said that Kevin Durant and the Houston Rockets were winners for this extension, saying the Rockets held firm in talks with KD about not giving him a max deal. And ultimately, the two sides were able to find a happy middle ground at 2 years, $90 million. That's still a big contract for Durant going into his age 38 and 39 seasons, but he's shown few signs of slowing down and remains one of the game's elite offensive weapons. Durant wanted to be in Houston and gets a sizable contract, but shows his commitment to trying to win by not demanding the absolute max he could have received. That's not for nothing. The Rockets traded for Durant in hopes for creating an immediate title window, and by locking Durant in for the next 3 seasons, they've done just that. Had the two sides ended up in a stalemate, the pressure would have intensified on Houston to win a title this season, and while the expectations are still to contend, they'll feel like they've given themselves a 3-year window to compete. Again, this is so important because, number one, you don't make a trade using a young asset that you did just give a contract extension to in Jalen Green, or a player in Dylan Brooks who was relatively productive for you in his, short stint with the Houston Rockets. You don't just move off of those guys who are both also contract controlled moving forward for an aging Kevin Durant who might mess around and leave you this summer, right? Kevin Durant's commitment to this Houston Rockets team is built off of two things. One, it was one of his 3 destinations. As most of you probably remember, the Houston Rockets, San Antonio Spurs, Miami Heat, all places with no state income tax. Just throwing that out there as something that I feel like was a big draw for Kevin Durant in terms of where he wanted to go if he were to be moved, when he was to be moved by the Phoenix Suns. Not only is that a net positive for him being able to get this $90 million in a, again, a tax-free state, but also it puts him in position to, again, pretty much see himself into his near 40s as a guy that has a lucrative deal, still allows cap flexibility for the Houston Rockets to get better around him. Also, it helps that Amen Thompson is on a rookie deal. It helps that Alperen Sengun is only starting his new rookie extension, right? This Houston Rockets team is positioned to not only be good for this season with what they currently have on the roster, but they should have the cap flexibility to be able to do even more moving forward because of the fact that Kevin Durant did not take the full max extension, or was not, and they were able to come to an agreement where they were able to meet in the middle where he still gets a lucrative deal without taking the absolute max. This is a win-win for both the Houston Rockets and Kevin Durant, because Kevin Durant now has a long-term deal that pushes him for the next 2 to 3 seasons, where he is pretty much as fully secure into whenever he chooses to retire, which I think would be around age 40, while also giving the Houston Rockets the window they want and the flexibility to make moves on the margins. Another winner, shout out to Toumani Camara. Bro, what? I think people do not realize, because he's been such a solid defender in the league from get-go, and more particularly showed off his defensive chops last season as an All-NBA first-team guy on the defensive side of the ball, People just forget that once upon a time, he was literally a throw in in a Phoenix Suns trade to get Yusuf Nurkic, who's not even on the team now, by the way. Just throwing that out there. This Portland Trailblazers team, right, has positioned themselves in a real way to feel good about themselves moving forward with their future. 4 years, $82 million for a guy who's a lockdown perimeter defender, a guy who has the chance to be a perennial first team all defensive caliber player on the perimeter, a guy who honestly most people probably didn't see the upside of being a $20 million a year player when he first was traded to Portland in the first place. Not probably. He was not going to be considered as a $20 million a year player when he first was traded. This was considered a throw-in guy that was just a young asset from the Phoenix Suns to help sweeten up the deal, given the fact that, honestly, it was already tough enough moving off of a former top pick in DeAndre Ayton at the time. You look at the circumstances, right? And you have to really ask yourself, when you look at a guy like Toumani Camara, and you pair it with the fact that the Portland Trailblazers were able to also re-up on Shaedon Sharpe for around about 23, $24 million a year himself, because I believe he signed to 4 years, $90 million. This puts them in a position where, as a team that's kind of thrown good money after bad, because let's be honest, the Jeremy Grant, the Jeremy Grant deal right now, very lucrative. Now, granted, it's now closer to the back end. Well, he's still got about 2-3 more years left on the contract. So, very hefty contract. The Drew Holiday contract that they traded for when moving off of Anthony Simons, kind of a hefty contract. Obviously, the Damian Lillard contract, although is not insanely big, is another, relatively decent number on the books for a player who isn't going to play this season and might not be super productive in heavy minutes in years to come. This Portland Trailblazers team has money invested well in players that I think are going to stick. I think Toumani Camara deserves to be considered as part of the core for this team moving forward. I think Shaedon Sharpe deserves to be considered as part of the core for this team moving forward. I think that Donovan Clingan deserves to be considered as a core member of this team moving forward. I will say that I think the jury is still out on Scoot Henderson. The jury is still out on Scoot Henderson because his injury concerns have made him somebody that I feel like we haven't been able to really see him blossom. We've seen spurts of it, particularly last year. He had a really strong stretch where he was starting to look like a guy that was starting to put it all together. The game was starting to slow down for him a little bit. And a lot of the compliments that he was given coming out of G League Ignite as a dude who was considered as a well-polished point guard, a guy who seemed NBA ready, who had the NBA speed kind of down pat as a player that could be efficient and effective as a driver and as a facilitator. We started to see signs of that last season, but I think the injury concerns have really kind of put him in a weird position. But let me read something from CBS Sports about this real quick. And I'm going to be using them a lot throughout this podcast as a litmus test for kind of the overall consensus around some of these winners and losers. So they say, given the kind of money we've seen thrown around lately, being able to lock up 2 quality players with upside to 8-figure deals is a win for Portland. There's still a speculative element to Sharpe, but he showed some real growth last year, taking a major stride in terms of his efficiency as a finisher in his third season. He averaged 18.5 points, 14.5 rebounds per game, while shooting the 3-point shot is still a big question that will determine exactly what level of offensive threat he can become. He started to harness his explosiveness and has real star upside, especially if the shooting ever clicks. With Camara, they get an elite level defender on the wing to sign for a team-friendly number. That $82 million figure is extremely reasonable for an all-NBA caliber defender forward who also shot 37.5% from 3 last season. To get that kind of deal done without needing to squeeze a guy in restricted free agency, which always strains the player-team relationship, is a win for the Blazers. That last part is so important. Not having to get squeezed in restricted free agency this upcoming summer is also a big benefit, particularly for Toumani Camara. Let's use this past summer's issues with Quentin Grimes, Cam Thomas, the biggest culprit, Jonathan Kuminga. All players who I think were well deserving of getting some kind of significant contract extensions. All three players who ended up signing to the qualifying offer. Well, Jonathan Isaac ended up getting a real contract extension, but he was really up the gun in terms of in terms of potentially having to sign the qualifying offer. Those other two, being Quentin Grimes and Cam Thomas, ended up having to bet on themselves and taking the qualifying offer for the upcoming season. I do not think, if you're the Portland Trailblazers, that gets an ingrown talent like this one into Toumani Camara, who was a knockdown three-point shooter, granted on low volume last season, but still 38% from beyond the arc is still high level, even on 3 to 4 attempts per night. From a guy who was an all-NBA caliber defender last season, to play hardball with him, knowing that you are going to have to pay at least $20 million if he has another all-NBA caliber season from on the defensive side of the ball, he's going to end up commanding much more money. And instead, now you get him on this team friendly deal. Toumani Camara is one of the best assets in the NBA. And honestly, you can make an argument that the Portland Trailblazers have one of the best cap machinations in the NBA. Look at what they have in terms of their team friendly deals in Deni Avdija, now Toumani Camara, Shaedon Sharpe. You still have Donovan Clingan, who I think has the caliber of being a top 10 rim protector in the league as soon as next season. And pair that with also Scoot Henderson, who I think has the upside to be a top 15 guard in this league someday, still on his rookie contract and still has about 2 more cost-controlled years under contract before they have to worry about giving him a real contract extension. This team has one of the better roster constructions in the NBA in terms of team-friendly deals. When you also look at the fact that even though Drew Holiday and Damian Lillard and Jeremy Grant all have these relatively hefty contracts, more so Jeremy Grant and Drew Holiday, they're also relatively movable, because in today's NBA, with things being set where the second apron hard caps teams, it puts a lot of teams in a position where they can't aggregate draft picks or multiple players. The sizable contracts like Drew Holiday, like Jeremy Grant, allows them to be able to move that one player or those two players for significant assets without having to give up their own draft capital in the meantime. Or if you have to attach draft capital in order to sweeten up the deal, it still allows you to get significant value, either it being multiple young players or multiple draft picks in exchange for those guys. So you have players like Toumani, Shaedon, Scoot, Young Han Zen, Donovan Clingan, Deni Avdija, all signed through 2027, 2028. And then you have the flexibility to be able to move off of guys like Drew Holiday and Jeremy Grant for real lucrative contracts down the line to keep this youth movement going. Very solid moves on the margins by a team like the Portland Trailblazers, who has been known for throwing good money after bad for the last couple of years, but this feels like some pretty decent contract moves for them to kind of continue to solidify what kind of youth movement they have going. And I think they're going to be a really special team this upcoming year. Do I see them making the playoffs? No. But they were a team that was on everybody's radar towards the back half of last season. And would I be surprised if they were like how the Phoenix Suns were when they made that run out of the bubble, where they went from being a fringe playoff team to being a team that was really discussed as one of the teams to fear in the Western Conference? I wouldn't be surprised if the Portland Trailblazers were able to do that, given the fact that they have some real veteran presence in the room with Drew Holiday, with Jeremy Grant in that locker room to help them want to play real winning basketball. And Lord only knows if a season from now they also still bring in Damian Lillard with those three guys, and you have Toumani, and you have Shaedon Sharpe, and you have another year of Donovan Clingan. This year might not be the Phoenix Suns bubble to near championship leap, but I think that next season, 2026, 2027, we might be talking about the Portland Trailblazers as like one of those teams in the Western Conference that's like a dark horse contender with a chance to like really make some noise in the West, given the fact that, the West is also really old, and a handful of those older guys might mess around, fall off a cliff by the time we get to next season. So a lot of different things to touch on moving forward when it comes to the Portland Trailblazers. But those two guys in particular, Toumani Camara and Shaden Sharp, being locked down long term, signs of good things to come for them. You guys let me know in the comment section down below who you think are some NBA extension winners from the other day. I think there were a handful of interesting names that did and didn't come up.